On the morning of June 23, 2010, Eric Lawrence prepared for another solitary escape. He placed a tent, a sleeping bag, and a carefully packed backpack, enough supplies for 3 days, into the trunk of his blue Honda Civic. At 27, the software engineer had grown accustomed to leaving civilization behind, even if only briefly. This time, his destination was the Cascade Mountains, deep within Mount Hood National Forest, where he intended to walk the trails alone for the weekend. For Eric, these journeys were a form of quiet restoration. After 4 years at a Portland-based IT firm, the routines of office life had begun to weigh on him. He lived by himself in a modest apartment in the Hawthorne neighborhood, known to those around him as reserved and distant, yet unfailingly courteous. Social gatherings held little appeal. Nature did. Nearly every weekend, he vanished into the surrounding wilderness, sometimes for days. Friends from his college years later said these trips were his way of breathing again. He never invited company. Solitude was not loneliness to him, it was necessity. That Thursday night, before leaving, Eric called his mother, Linda Lawrence, in Seattle. They spoke for roughly 20 minutes. He described his plans, mentioned a new hiking route he had discovered online, and promised to call her Sunday evening once he was home. Nothing in his voice suggested distress. Linda would later say he sounded calm, grounded, entirely himself. Early Friday morning, Eric stopped at a nearby gas station. He filled his tank, purchased a few energy bars, and asked the cashier for directions to Route 26, the road leading into the mountains. Surveillance footage logged the time, 8:43 a.m. It was the final confirmed sighting of Eric Lawrence alive. The drive to the Timberline trailhead took close to 2 hours. Upon arrival, Eric parked in a small tourist lot beside an information board displaying maps and safety notices. The location sat roughly 1,200 meters above sea level. The day began bright and clear, but by midday, clouds drifted in, dimming the light. According to his plan, Eric intended to hike approximately 15 kilometers along the main trail before branching off toward a smaller path that led to a secluded lake. That was where he planned to camp. The route itself was not considered dangerous, but it demanded stamina due to constant elevation changes. Dense stands of fir and spruce surrounded the trail, their branches interlocking so tightly that daylight struggled to reach the forest floor. Saturday morning came and went without word. Eric's phone, which he usually checked in with, remained silent. Linda tried calling throughout the day, each attempt going straight to voicemail. By Sunday evening, unease set in. She contacted his workplace, only to be told that Eric had taken the weekend off and was not expected back until Monday. When Monday arrived and Eric neither appeared at work nor returned any calls, Linda contacted the Portland police. The responding officer explained that adults were not typically declared missing until 48 hours had passed. However, given that Eric had gone into the mountains alone and had been unreachable for over 3 days, authorities agreed that waiting carried too much risk. A search was approved. On Tuesday morning, the Clackamas County Rescue Team arrived at the trailhead. Eric's Honda Civic was exactly where he had left it. The doors were locked. The keys were gone. Inside, there was no sign of a struggle or forced entry. A jacket lay on the back seat, likely abandoned because the weather had seemed warm enough without it. Search efforts began along the main trail. 8 rescuers, accompanied by tracking dogs, followed the path Eric was believed to have taken. About a mile in, they found bootprints pressed into damp soil near a narrow stream. The size and tread matched the hiking boots Linda confirmed her son owned. Half a kilometer beyond that point, the search took an unsettling turn. Eric's backpack was discovered hanging from a pine branch roughly 2 meters above the ground. It was unzipped, yet everything inside remained untouched: spare clothing, a flashlight, a compass, a trail map, 2 energy bars, and a half-empty water bottle. Nearby, resting on the forest floor, lay his tent and sleeping bag, folded carefully, almost deliberately. The location made no sense. The ground was uneven, tangled with roots and stones. Any experienced hiker would have avoided camping there, especially when a flat clearing existed just a short distance farther along the trail. Equally troubling was the height of the backpack. It was positioned too high to have been placed casually, and far beyond what would be necessary to protect it from wildlife. The search expanded over the following days. Nearly 40 volunteers from local hiking groups joined rescue teams, scouring a 5-kilometer radius. They checked ravines, rocky ledges, and dense undergrowth. A Coast Guard helicopter conducted multiple aerial sweeps, but the thick canopy rendered the ground nearly invisible. Tracking dogs followed Eric's scent only briefly. Roughly 100 meters beyond the abandoned campsite, the trail ended at a massive moss-covered boulder. Past that point, there was nothing. No footprints. No snapped branches. No disturbance of any kind. It was as though Eric Lawrence had stepped beyond the visible world, and never stepped back. For more than 2 weeks, search teams combed the wilderness relentlessly. Over 20 square kilometers of forest were examined in detail. Every stream and narrow river was traced, each one considered a possible path where a body might have been carried by the current. Rescuers descended into caves, squeezed through rocky fissures, and inspected natural hollows where someone could have fallen or hidden. Residents from nearby areas were questioned repeatedly, yet not a single witness recalled seeing a lone hiker matching Eric's description. After a month passed with no trace, officials made a quiet decision. The active search was formally called off. Eric Lawrence's case was handed over to the district prosecutor's missing persons unit, where it would join countless others marked by uncertainty rather than resolution. Still, his family refused to let the silence settle. For months afterward, they pursued their own efforts, funding private searches, organizing volunteers, following rumors that led nowhere. Linda Lawrence could not accept the idea that her son had simply been erased. Every few months, she returned to Oregon. She taped posters bearing Eric's face to storefront windows, gas pumps, and campground notice boards. She spoke with clerks, attendants, and travelers, asking the same questions again and again. A reward of $5,000 was printed beneath his photograph, accompanied by a single plea: information, living or otherwise. Her search expanded beyond geography. Linda reached out to other families who had lost loved ones on the trails. She studied disappearance records from national forests and learned unsettling patterns. Roughly 10 people vanished each year in the Cascade Mountains. Most were located quickly, injured, disoriented, alive. But 2 or 3 every year were never found at all. Their stories ended without answers. 1 year after Eric disappeared, Linda hired Robert Clark, a former investigator with the Oregon State Police. Clark accepted the case with caution. He made it clear that survival was no longer a realistic expectation. Still, he believed truth might remain. Over the next month, Clark walked the same paths Eric had taken. He questioned Forest Service employees who had been on duty that week. He reviewed weather reports from June 2010, studying shifts in temperature and visibility. As the pieces came together, several overlooked details stood out. The backpack, for one, had been suspended at a height easily reachable by someone around 180 centimeters tall. Eric stood at 174. It was close enough to raise questions. The tent and sleeping bag were another concern. They were folded with care, too much care for a tired hiker preparing to sleep. The arrangement suggested deliberate hands, not exhaustion. Clark uncovered something else. At the time of Eric's disappearance, a logging crew had been operating illegally in that section of forest, harvesting timber for a private company. They lacked permits, which explained why no official record of their presence existed. When Clark attempted to locate the workers, he discovered most had vanished as well, undocumented laborers who had scattered once the job was done. Only one man could be found. His name was Carlos Mendez, a 38-year-old truck driver responsible for hauling logs out of the area. Mendez agreed to speak only after being promised that his immigration status would not be scrutinized. He confirmed that the crew had been active from mid-June through early August of 2010. According to Mendez, the operation was centered around a temporary sawmill roughly 3 kilometers from where Eric's belongings were discovered. The site consisted of crude barracks, a storage shed, and the mill itself. The crew was led by an American foreman named Michael, his surname forgotten. Michael handled hiring, paid in cash, and enforced strict isolation. Contact with outsiders was forbidden. Mendez described the foreman as tall, in his mid-40s, with dark hair and a scar running along his left cheek. Regardless of heat, he wore heavy work boots and a denim jacket. The workers feared him. He dismissed people without warning and withheld pay without explanation. On more than one occasion, Mendez witnessed him assault laborers over minor mistakes. Toward the end of June, Michael's behavior shifted. His temper worsened. His suspicion deepened. He ordered that no worker move more than 100 meters from camp. Night watches were established. Anyone hearing shouts in the forest was instructed to ignore them. When questioned about the sudden restrictions, Michael claimed that intruders had appeared, people who could jeopardize the operation. Soon after, unsettling details emerged. Metal chains began to appear on trees surrounding the camp, where none had been before. And from that moment on, the forest no longer felt empty, it felt guarded. Michael claimed the chains were meant for hoisting timber. Yet they were fastened far too high and placed where no lifting work could reasonably be done. Their positions felt wrong, ritualistic rather than practical. Around the same time, tools began to vanish from the shed. Heavy sledgehammers. Axes. Nothing was reported missing officially, and no worker admitted to taking anything without permission. One night, Carlos Mendez woke suddenly. From beyond the barracks came the sound of movement, branches snapping, leaves crushed under weight. Something was being dragged across the forest floor. The noise persisted for nearly an hour before fading into stillness. At first light, Mendez saw marks cut deep into the soil, long grooves as though a massive sack, or a body, had been pulled away. The trail led straight from the camp into the woods, vanishing beneath thick ferns. When Mendez spoke of it, the others warned him into silence. Questions, they said, were dangerous. An older worker named Pedro later leaned close and whispered that he had witnessed something worse. Late one night, he saw Michael standing among the trees, speaking softly to someone unseen. Another voice answered, low, desperate, pleading. Then came a heavy, dull impact. After that, nothing. Days later, Michael summoned the entire crew. His message was simple. Anyone who left without permission, or spoke of the sawmill to outsiders, would be left hanging from a tree like a warning sign. He gestured toward the forest and said he already had an example prepared, something meant to make the rules unforgettable. No one asked what he meant. From that point on, fear ruled the camp. Conversation ceased. Eyes stayed down. Every man worked quietly, careful not to draw attention. The operation continued another month. Then, without explanation, it ended. The sawmill was dismantled, the workers driven into the city, and dismissed as abruptly as they had been hired. Robert Clark passed everything Mendez had shared to the police. But without physical evidence, witnesses willing to testify, or even a confirmed identity for the foreman, the investigation stalled. Clark returned to the forest, searching for remains of the illegal mill. A year had erased it completely. The ground had been cleared. No structures remained. No scars of labor were visible. It was as if the camp had never existed. Interest in Eric Lawrence's disappearance slowly faded. Officially, the case stayed open. In practice, it went dormant. Linda Lawrence held on to hope, but time worked against her. Each passing month narrowed the possibility of survival. In police files, Eric's name was placed under a familiar category, disappearance under unclear circumstances. It was a quiet way of admitting that death was assumed, even if never proven. 2 years passed. Linda left Seattle and relocated to Portland, determined to remain close to the place that had taken her son. She found work with a local charity that supported families of the missing. And every weekend, she drove back into the mountains, walking trails, scanning clearings, searching for anything that might explain what had happened. By October of 2013, rain had soaked the region for weeks. Hunting season opened late, delayed by the weather. When conditions finally improved, 2 brothers, Tom and Jerry Harrison, returned to familiar ground. They chose a stretch of forest roughly 5 kilometers from where Eric had vanished, unaware of the connection. Before dawn on October 28, the brothers entered the woods. They moved confidently, following faint animal paths toward known watering areas. Tom, 42, worked as a mechanic in town. Jerry, 39, was employed at a nearby sawmill. Both men had hunted these woods for 2 decades and rarely came home empty-handed. Around 7 in the morning, they paused in a small clearing. Jerry poured coffee from a thermos while Tom studied a map, marking fresh deer signs spotted the day before. The air was cold, no warmer than 5 degrees Celsius, but clear. Most of the leaves had already fallen, opening the forest in ways summer never allowed. They decided to separate. Tom headed north, toward the mountainside where salt licks drew wildlife. Jerry turned west, into a dense stand of spruce where deer often hid during daylight hours. They agreed to regroup in 3 hours. Jerry had walked about a mile when something caught his eye. Between the tall trunks, roughly 50 meters ahead, hung a shape that did not belong. It was dark. Suspended high above the ground. Not a tree. Not an animal. It moved gently with the wind. And the forest, once silent, seemed to be watching. As Jerry moved closer, understanding struck him with sudden clarity. What hung before him was no animal, no illusion of shadow and branch, but human remains. A skeleton dangled upside down from a massive spruce, held aloft by thick iron chains wrapped tightly around the ankles. The arms were bound behind the back with a thin cord, now so degraded by time that only fragile remnants clung to the bones. The body was suspended nearly 5 meters above the forest floor. Fragments of clothing and desiccated skin still adhered to the skeletal frame. Fighting the shock, Jerry radioed his brother at once, urging him to come immediately. Tom arrived roughly 20 minutes later. One look was enough. This was a human death, and a crime scene. The brothers kept their distance. They took photographs with their phones and contacted emergency services without disturbing anything. Sheriff's deputies reached the location about an hour later. Senior Deputy David Miller assessed the scene and immediately requested forensic specialists and crime scene photographers. Yellow tape was stretched wide, sealing off a 100-meter perimeter around the tree. Recovering the remains was slow and deliberate. It took hours. Investigators used ladders and hoisting equipment to lower the skeleton without compromising evidence. The chains proved to be crudely manufactured, thick metal links welded together by hand. Though weathered by years of exposure, they remained disturbingly intact. The rope that once restrained the hands had nearly disintegrated, leaving only scattered fibers. Examination of the skull revealed extensive fractures to the back and upper sides of the head. The pattern told a clear story: repeated strikes delivered with a heavy blunt object, likely a sledgehammer or large hammer. Additional fractures were found in the ribs and bones of the hands. These injuries may have occurred around the time of death or developed later through years of environmental stress. Portions of clothing had survived. Investigators identified remains of jeans, a t-shirt, and sturdy hiking boots. Inside the jeans, they found a waterproof wristwatch, a wallet containing documents, and several coins. Although water damage had blurred much of the paperwork, one detail remained legible. The driver's license bore the name Eric Daniel Lawrence. Date of birth, May 23, 1983. The discovery was immediately relayed to the Missing Persons Division. Eric Lawrence's long-dormant file was pulled from storage and reclassified. What had once been an unresolved disappearance was now officially treated as homicide. Eric's mother arrived the following day. Dental records confirmed what the documents suggested. The remains were her son's. The site of the hanging was located roughly 4 kilometers from where Eric's belongings had been found 3 years earlier. There was no road linking the 2 points, no clear trail, no direct route. Between them stretched dense woodland, broken by ravines and jagged rock formations. Transporting a body through that terrain would have required time, planning, and effort. The tree itself stood in a shallow depression, surrounded on all sides by thick underbrush. The location was naturally concealed, invisible unless one passed through it by chance. That isolation explained why the remains had gone unnoticed for so long. The hunters found it only because they were tracking a wounded deer that fled into the hollow. Forensic experts concluded that suspending the body in this manner would have required at least 2 individuals. Lifting an adult man to such a height alone, especially in that environment, would have been nearly impossible. This was not an impulsive act. It was deliberate. Analysis of the skull fractures confirmed the cause of death: multiple blows to the head. The first strike landed from behind, shattering the occipital bone. Eric never saw the attacker. The injuries were consistent with a flat, heavy tool, again pointing to a hammer-like weapon. The pathologist confirmed Eric's age at death as 27, matching the year he vanished. No signs of other trauma were present beyond the fractures. The state of the remains indicated the body had hung in that tree for approximately 3 years, perfectly aligning with the timeline of his disappearance. The surrounding area was swept with metal detectors in hopes of locating the murder weapon or additional evidence. Several metal objects were uncovered about 30 meters from the tree. And once again, the forest offered fragments, but not the whole truth. The metal detector sweep uncovered nothing immediately damning. Just remnants of age and abandonment, old nails, a length of corroded wire, and the shattered handle of a hammer. The handle was sent to the lab, but analysis revealed no blood, no tissue, no trace of biological material. Still, its presence mattered. Investigators returned to the statement Carlos Mendez had given years earlier to a private detective. In light of the discovery, his words carried a different gravity. The unexplained sounds in the woods. The missing sledgehammers. The foreman's threats. What once sounded like fear now resembled warning. Efforts intensified to identify and locate the man who had overseen the illegal sawmill. Mendez was summoned again, this time by law enforcement. Faced with the reality of what had been found, he spoke more openly. He described additional details, small habits, changes in mood, moments that had seemed insignificant before. One detail stood out. Around the estimated time of Eric Lawrence's death, the foreman vanished from camp for 2 full days. Tracking him down proved difficult. Most of the workers had been undocumented laborers who scattered once the operation shut down. Many avoided authorities out of fear. Even so, investigators persisted, and slowly, the silence began to crack. 2 more witnesses were located. One was Pedro Gonzalez, the older worker Mendez had mentioned. He agreed to speak only under strict assurances of anonymity. The interview was arranged in the office of an immigration attorney in Portland. Gonzalez, 63, visibly shaken and speaking through an interpreter, described a man ruled by cruelty. The foreman enforced obedience through intimidation and violence, punishing even minor mistakes. Gonzalez recalled a moment in late June of 2010 that never left him. One evening, the foreman arrived at camp with a young white man dressed in hiking clothes. The stranger was bound and terrified. Michael forced the workers to gather and look at him. This, he said, was what happened to those who learned too much. The captive was locked inside a rusted metal container normally used for storing tools. It sat near the generator at the edge of camp. At night, Gonzalez heard screams, muffled, desperate, echoing from inside. When he tried to approach, Michael drove him away with threats. On the 3rd night, the sound stopped. The next morning, Gonzalez saw Michael and 2 workers drag something heavy from the container, wrapped tightly in tarpaulin. They loaded it onto a cart and disappeared into the forest. They returned hours later, without the cart. Without the bundle. No explanation was given. No questions were allowed. The container was declared off-limits, and silence was demanded. A 3rd witness, Ricardo Vasquez, later confirmed Gonzalez's account. 28 years old at the time, Vasquez worked directly at the sawmill. He remembered the captive clearly, about his own age, slim build, dark hair. Jeans. A t-shirt. Brown hiking boots. Vasquez added something new. Michael liked to document what he called his accomplishments. He carried an old digital camera and spoke openly about keeping a personal record, something to remember important moments by. After the captive vanished, the foreman displayed photographs to the workers, warning them that he had proof of their obedience. Proof that could destroy them if they ever spoke. This revelation shifted the investigation. If photographs existed, then evidence might still survive, hidden, stored, forgotten. Detectives began searching for any location connected to the foreman where belongings or records could have been kept. But the trail was thin. No one knew his full name. No documents. Only a first name and a shadowed memory. Authorities turned to corporate archives, combing through records of logging companies operating in Oregon at the time. Weeks passed before something surfaced. Pacific Timber Works. Among their files was a name that fit. Michael Royce. 46 years old. Employed as a temporary foreman on multiple forest projects in 2010. The records revealed more. Royce had a criminal history, convictions for aggravated assault and illegal weapons possession. He had served 3 years in an Oregon state prison from 2005 to 2008. After his release, he joined Pacific Timber Works and quickly earned a reputation. Harsh. Controlling. Effective under pressure. A man trusted to push crews where others would not. A man who knew how to make people disappear, and keep them silent. Royce's records listed a rental address on the outskirts of Portland, a small warehouse used to store equipment and personal effects. With a warrant secured, investigators went to the site. The building sat in an industrial zone lined with identical metal units, each rented out for storage. The property owner, Frank Adams, an elderly man who managed the complex, confirmed that Michael Royce had leased unit number 27 since 2009. Rent was always paid on time. Always in cash. Royce rarely appeared, and when he did, it was usually after dark. Adams described him as tall, dark-haired, with a noticeable scar on his face, details that aligned perfectly with witness statements. When the doors of the unit were finally opened, the space revealed its purpose. Tools were stacked along the walls. Logging equipment parts lay scattered across the floor. Several sledgehammers and axes rested among them, worn but carefully maintained. In one corner stood a metal cabinet secured with a heavy padlock. Once forced open, its contents shifted the investigation irrevocably. Inside were a Canon digital camera, multiple flash drives, and a handmade photo album. What the devices contained confirmed the worst fears of investigators. The images showed bound individuals, scenes of brutal assaults, and bodies suspended from trees. Forensic comparison established that the terrain visible in several photographs matched the forest where Eric Lawrence's remains had been discovered. One image, in particular, left no doubt. It clearly showed Eric's face. Linda Lawrence was asked to view the photograph. She identified her son immediately. The image had been taken shortly before his death. His face was swollen and bruised. His expression captured fear in its purest form. Pain. Awareness. The photo album held more. At least 5 additional victims appeared in its pages, young men, all between 20 and 35 years old. Beside each photograph were handwritten notes. Dates. Locations. Methods. Next to Eric's image, Royce had written, "Tourist. June 27. Sledgehammer. Hung as an example to the Mexicans." Further analysis showed a chilling pattern. Royce had been killing for years. His targets were solitary hikers, men who ventured alone into remote forest regions. He hunted them deliberately. Afterward, he used their deaths as instruments of control, terrorizing undocumented workers at his illegal logging sites. Among the items recovered were articles of clothing stained with dried blood. Laboratory testing confirmed what investigators already suspected. The blood on a t-shirt and jeans belonged to Eric Lawrence. DNA matched the remains recovered from the tree. There was no longer any doubt. Plans were immediately made to locate and arrest Michael Royce. But the trail had already gone cold. Records showed that Royce had not visited the warehouse in over a year. Frank Adams reported his last confirmed sighting of the tenant in October 2012. Rent payments had stopped soon after. Still, Adams had never entered the unit himself, unsettled by what might be inside. What followed was no longer a local search. Michael Royce became the subject of a nationwide manhunt. His photograph was circulated to law enforcement agencies across the country. A federal arrest warrant was issued. Given the scale and nature of the crimes, the case was transferred to the FBI and classified as a serial murder investigation. Federal agents expanded the inquiry, focusing on identifying additional victims. Review of Royce's photographic archive revealed that the murders spanned multiple states: Oregon, Washington, Northern California. The pattern suggested a transient lifestyle, following seasonal forestry work, moving unnoticed from region to region. Missing persons databases were cross-referenced. 2 more victims were identified. Jason Park, 22, a college student from Seattle, vanished during a solo hike in August 2009. David Clark, 30, a photographer from San Francisco, disappeared in September 2011. Search operations were launched in areas believed to match locations shown in Royce's photographs. The task was daunting. Dense forest landscapes offered few landmarks. Trees blurred together. Terrain repeated itself endlessly. Still, investigators pressed on, studying shadows, slopes, rock formations, hoping that somewhere in the silence, the land would give up what it had been forced to hide. Because some truths, no matter how deeply buried, are never meant to stay unseen. The search for Michael Royce finally broke open in January of 2014. FBI agents received a tip from California, quiet, indirect, but precise. The source was a man calling himself Alberto Sanchez. He claimed to know the location of a former logging foreman who had vanished under a false identity. Sanchez worked on an illegal marijuana grow hidden deep within Northern California's wilderness. According to him, a man using the name Mark Johnson had joined the operation roughly 18 months earlier. Yet Sanchez recognized him immediately. The scar on his face. the way he carried himself. It was Michael Royce, the same man Sanchez had worked under during logging operations in Oregon back in 2011. The plantation sat in the isolated forests of Humboldt County, nearly 30 kilometers from the nearest town. Access was limited to rugged forest roads passable only by four-wheel drive vehicles, and even then, only during dry months. Royce served as the site's security enforcer. He lived alone in a small trailer on the property. Once the information was verified, federal agents began preparing an arrest. The terrain, the isolation, and Royce's history of violence raised immediate concerns. Intelligence confirmed he was armed. A tactical unit was authorized. The operation was given a name, Lumberjack, and scheduled for the early hours of February 5, 2014. In the days leading up to the arrest, agents conducted surveillance. The gross site matched Sanchez's description precisely. Several structures stood within a clearing, a main residence for the owners, 3 trailers for laborers, a storage warehouse, and a small workshop. Royce's trailer sat apart from the rest, near a dirt road at the edge of the property. Observation showed a man who kept to himself. He spoke little. He patrolled often. He carried a hunting rifle and a handgun openly. The plantation owners regarded him warily, but valued his readiness to deal harshly with intruders. Before dawn on February 5, 12 FBI agents, supported by local sheriff's deputies, sealed off all exit routes. At approximately 6 a.m., the entry team approached Royce's trailer while he was still asleep. The arrest was swift. No shots were fired. Caught off guard, Royce had no time to reach his weapons. When confronted, he claimed his name was Mark Johnson and insisted a mistake had been made. Fingerprints ended the argument. So did the scar. Inside the trailer, agents found forged identification documents, along with multiple items tying him directly to the murders. Among them was a sledgehammer bearing dried blood stains. Another digital camera was recovered, its contents unmistakable. They also discovered a diary. Royce had kept it for years. The entries were meticulous, methodical, detached. He described each killing in detail, including the murder of Eric Lawrence. In his writing, Royce framed his actions not as crimes, but as discipline, necessary measures to maintain control over undocumented laborers. One entry, dated June 27, 2010, outlined Eric's final days. Royce wrote that he first noticed Eric alone on a hiking trail and immediately saw a risk. A witness. Approaching him under the guise of a forest ranger, Royce warned of hazardous work ahead and convinced Eric to change his route. Trusting him, Eric followed. Royce led him straight into the logging camp. There, he attacked from behind, striking Eric's head with a sledgehammer. Injured but alive, Eric was restrained and locked inside a metal container. For 3 days, he was kept there, beaten periodically and displayed to terrify the workers. On the 4th day, Royce ended his life with several final blows. The body, he wrote, was then carried deep into the forest and suspended from a tree in a way designed to leave a lasting impression. Fear, Royce believed, was the most effective tool of control. The diary listed others. 7 victims in total. Between 2008 and 2012. All were young men. All were alone. All were encountered in remote forest regions. Royce selected them deliberately, knowing that disappearances in such places were often blamed on accidents, weather, or the wilderness itself. In his mind, the forest was not just a hiding place. It was an accomplice. Michael Royce was brought to trial in October 2014 at a federal courthouse in Portland. Prosecutors laid out a sweeping case, charging him with 7 counts of first-degree murder, along with kidnapping, illegal firearms possession, and the coordination of criminal operations. From the outset, the government made its position clear: it would pursue the harshest punishment allowed under the law. The defense attempted a different path. Royce's attorneys argued that he was not fully responsible for his actions, pointing to a troubled upbringing and psychological damage sustained during his military service. Medical evaluations were introduced, diagnosing him with post-traumatic stress disorder and additional mental health conditions that, according to the defense, impaired his judgment and self-control. But the evidence told another story. The diary recovered from Royce's trailer, along with the photographs found in his possession, revealed crimes that were neither impulsive nor confused. They were organized, methodical, and intentional. Court-appointed psychiatrists testified that Royce understood exactly what he was doing and possessed the capacity to govern his behavior. The insanity defense collapsed under scrutiny and was formally dismissed. Several former workers from the illegal logging operations testified for the prosecution. Carlos Mendez, Pedro Gonzalez, and Ricardo Vasquez each described a system built on fear. They spoke of threats, public punishments, and captives used as living warnings. Their statements aligned precisely with entries from Royce's own journal. Eric Lawrence's mother, Linda, also took the stand. She spoke quietly at first, about her son's ambitions, his plans, and the last time she heard his voice. Then she described the years that followed, the unanswered questions, the endless waiting, the erosion of hope. Her testimony left the courtroom silent. Jurors later said it was impossible to forget her description of living without certainty, trapped between grief and denial. Expert witnesses reinforced the prosecution's case. A forensic pathologist detailed Eric's injuries, confirming that death resulted from repeated blunt force trauma. A weapons specialist examined the sledgehammers seized from Royce's residence and testified that one was consistent with the wounds documented in the autopsy. Particular attention was given to Royce's photographs. Most were ruled too disturbing to display, but several images showing Eric's face were admitted into evidence. Linda Lawrence identified her son without hesitation. The defense attempted to undermine the credibility of the witnesses, arguing that many were undocumented workers who might have testified falsely out of fear of deportation. The argument failed. Physical evidence, corroborating testimony, and Royce's own writings left no room for doubt. After 3 weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for 2 days. The verdict was unanimous, guilty on all counts. Sentencing was scheduled for December 15, 2014. During the hearing, families of the victims were invited to speak about the impact of the crimes. Linda Lawrence addressed the court again. She spoke of years spent searching, of hope that never died, and of the devastation that followed the truth. She urged the judge to impose the strongest possible sentence. Other families echoed her plea. Jason Park's parents described how their son's disappearance fractured their marriage and damaged their health. David Clark's sister spoke of years lived in limbo, sustained by false hope until Royce's arrest brought a brutal clarity. Royce declined to address the court. His attorneys requested leniency, citing his mental condition and cooperation with investigators, including assistance in locating victims' remains. They asked that the death penalty be avoided in favor of life imprisonment. Judge Margaret Henderson delivered her decision on December 15. Michael Royce was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole on each of the 7 murder convictions. The sentences were ordered to run consecutively, effectively condemning him to die behind bars. In her statement, Judge Henderson emphasized the calculated cruelty of the crimes and the defendant's complete absence of remorse. She stated that using murder as a tool of intimidation transformed each killing into an act of terror. The judge closed by offering condolences to the victims' families, acknowledging their resilience and determination in seeking justice. Following sentencing, Royce was transferred to a maximum security federal facility in Colorado, where he will spend the remainder of his life in solitary confinement. There would be no appeal to fate, only consequences. The defense submitted an appeal, but few within the legal community expect it to alter the outcome. The volume of conclusive evidence, combined with the calculated brutality of the crimes, leaves little room for reversal. The murder of Eric Lawrence has since taken its place among the most notorious serial cases in Oregon's history, reshaping public awareness of the hidden risks faced by those who travel alone into remote wilderness, and exposing the darker realities surrounding illegal labor in the forestry world. In the aftermath, state officials moved swiftly. Oversight of logging operations was strengthened, inspections became more frequent, and patrols along well-known hiking routes were expanded. Out of loss came resolve. Linda Lawrence transformed her grief into action by creating a memorial fund in her son's name. The foundation aids families of the missing, supports search and rescue missions, and advocates for new regulations requiring visitors to formally log their travel routes with national park authorities. Yet not all wounds have been given closure. The remains of Royce's other victims have never been recovered. Search efforts continue, guided by fragments from his journals and images from his private archive, as investigators hope that overlooked details may still reveal the truth. For the families left behind, time has not softened the ache. They wait, still, for answers, for remains to bury, for a chance to say goodbye with dignity. The story of Eric Lawrence reached its legal conclusion with the punishment of the man responsible. Justice, in its formal sense, was delivered. But justice does not erase absence. What remains are lives permanently altered and hearts forever marked. The case stands as a quiet warning, one that lingers beyond courtrooms and headlines, that places of breathtaking beauty can also conceal profound danger, and that darkness often hides where it is least expected.